I love this section. It's one of my favourite sections of the Old Testament. I think it speaks incredibly powerfully. The challenge is, I actually preached this just about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, from this particular passage in a previous series. So actually, when I came to it, I thought, right, we've got to look at it through a completely different lens. We're going to look at it through the lens of the journey of Elijah, as opposed to what we might, although I think we can learn an awful lot by looking at this particular section. Oh, dear me. Is that okay? Keep talking. Okay, thanks, Sam. I think it would be helpful to work through it in terms of what it can speak to us today. I think we're going to see three things as we work through. We're going to see the fragility of our emotions and our convictions. We're going to see the holistic care of God. And we're going to see the power of a God encounter. Those three things. And from that springboard, I think what we're going to be able to do is say, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us today? Let's start at the last one, just as a precursor to the journey. The idea of an encounter with God. I don't know where you are in your journey with the message of the Bible, in the living Jesus Christ. You might be listening online. I don't know where you are. But one of the things that I am utterly convinced of is that faith in Jesus Christ is not simply, it starts with a recognition and an acknowledgement of who he is. It recognizes our need of him. But it is a fundamental encounter that either dramatically or progressively changes us. It's what faith in Jesus Christ does. And so I want to just throw that out there at the beginning of our journey through this particular section. Because what I will hope we can do is we can orientate ourselves alongside Elijah's experience and say, well, where am I? Am I starting from that point of knowing a life-changing encounter with the living God? Just a heads up, I've read this particular section, I don't know how many times. There is a little bit that every time I've read it, I've got it wrong. I think you did an amazing job, Steve, to actually read, I'm going to say it really slowly, a broom bush. I've had a broom brush, a boom brush. It is one of the best tongue twisters in the whole of the Old Testament, so when I get it wrong, we've got the laugh out the way. Okay. So Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. I'm going to start with that. That's what's happening in the immediacy of the story. We've got this Queen Jezebel who has seen all of her in the previous section. We've seen all of the prophets of Baal under the leadership, in a sense, or the instigation or the impact of Elijah. We've seen all of those prophets of Baal have been slaughtered. And we've now seen her turn her wrath directly on this one individual. And he runs for his life. It seems a huge thing, and it is a huge thing, isn't it? And not surprisingly in some ways, but let's think about it a little bit. What is actually going on? Well, if you've not been able to keep up, what has happened up to now? New king over Israel, Ahab, we read in chapter 16 and verse 30, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. That's the context of the king Ahab, who we read about here, who tells Jezebel, his wife, what Elijah has done. That's the kind of king we got. He not only listened to how the narrator frames it in such a way that when we read it, we should be terrified on behalf of Ahab. Listen to what the narrator says in chapter 16, verse 31. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. The way it's written is to say, here's God's people with God's king who treats it as a trivial thing to do worse than Eve and Jeroboam. We should be quaking on behalf of Ahab. Because what the narrator is trying to help us to understand is, this is the living God that Ahab is trivializing his rebellion. Then we find that we have this marriage of a treaty, if you like, a marriage with political motivation. If you know anything of history, you know that this isn't anything new. It was happening in our country, read about King Henry VIII and all of that jazz, and we know that it has gone on continually throughout the history of the world. Political alliances and treaties through marriage. If you marry that person, then we won't go to war with you. We'll create economic prosperity between the two of us, and etc., etc. But the narrator is putting that decision alongside his willingness to reject and do evil and follow other gods. In other words, he's saying this King Ahab and the treaty that he has entered into with Jezebel is more than just a political expediency. It is a rebellion against God by the person who is there to be, if we look at King David, who had gone before him, the representative king on behalf of God for his people. You say, well, hang on a sec. For all of that's fine. But what we looked at in the previous chapter is by the hand of Elijah, or the instigation of Elijah, shall we say, all of the prophets of Baal are slaughtered. Isn't that extreme? Well, in our world, yes, it is absolutely extreme. And by God's grace and intervention and the gentling of the world, by his grace, we no longer see that kind of thing going on in the way that it has in the past. But at the same time, what we have to understand is the world that the ancients lived in was a world which was absolutely shaped by the gods. And the power of the gods and the outcomes for nations was more than just, is their God blessing them? It's actually got to the point where is their God true? Which God is the real powerful God? That's one thing. But then the other side of it is this. In chapter 18 and verse 2, there was a famine in Samaria. Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. And while Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves. So against the backdrop of this fearful slaying of the priests, we see that there was a preemptive strike by Jezebel against the priests of God. There was a determination to stamp out the message of God. That is the context in which Elijah runs for his life. You think that's just not surprising, is it? And yet, I think it's written in such a way that we also ask a question. Really? After what has just gone on, Elijah, are you running? What has just gone on? All of the prophets of Baal have come to Mount Carmel, and for all of theirs, we saw last week, for all of their desire for the Baals to prove their existence, the simple prayer of Elijah brought down heavenly flames on the altar, and the sacrifice was consumed. What an incredible experience. Elijah's God has just secured the most profound victory. There is nothing that could be greater in a way of proving the true nature of the living God. It wasn't as though this God had just proven his power. It's not as though in some way, like the Baals, like the Jezebel's behavior, Jezebel's behavior, keep going, like Jezebel's behavior had in some way won over with strength. It wasn't as though that's what had happened with Elijah, that he'd managed to mount up enough strength to beat these prophets. He was absolutely alone. He was as weak as you could imagine. And God intervened, and in an incredible, supernatural way that proved he was the living God. I think that speaks incredibly powerfully to who we are as people. We can go through the most amazing experiences of God, and yet we can come out the other side of that, and within a really short space of time, something that should not terrify us terrifies us again, and knocks us off course, and causes us to end up in a place of fear and all of those kind of things, that where our emotions and our experiences of this world overpower the truth of our knowledge of the eternal heavenly kingdom. That's what can happen. That's who we are. But there's something that is even more powerful that goes just before this experience, which speaks into the rest of the journey for Elijah in the narrative that we're looking at, and it's this. What has actually just happened? We read that there was a famine. We saw that while the famine was going on, Obadiah saved the prophets, hid them in caves. We know that Jezebel was trying to kill the prophets, but at the same time we know that there was a famine in the land, and it rolled on, and it rolled on, and it rolled on. What broke the famine? What broke the famine? What broke the judgment of God on God's people? What broke it? I don't think it was a prayer of Elijah that broke the famine, that broke the judgment of God on his people. What actually broke the judgment of God on his people was a sacrifice. Do you think the prophets had been praying up to that moment in time? Throughout all of the famine, do you think they had been praying intently that God would lift the famine? I'm sure they were. Those prophets that were hiding in the caves, those small number of prophets that remained. Do you think Elijah had been praying the same? It wasn't prayer that broke the famine. It wasn't prayer that broke the judgment of God. It was sacrifice that broke the judgment of God. That should just start bells ringing in our minds. We should be now thinking, oh man, the rest of the story of Elijah from this point on, the rest of the story of Elijah is from the context of sacrifice has been made, and now he and the people are in a different place of relationship with God because sacrifice has been made. How do we know that the sacrifice was accepted by God? Because the rains came. And the blessing of God poured out because the sacrifice had been made. And now the journey and the running that Elijah makes and the fear in Elijah's heart is actually in the context of now being accepted by God because of sacrifice. And he still runs. How does he feel? Verse 3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. I think that speaks, I said this last time we looked at this section, that speaks so incredibly powerfully into our generation that is disillusioned, that is fearful, that is lost, that is exhausted, that is anxiety-ridden, that feels the weight of this world on their shoulders, that is utterly finished. The world that I live in, Elijah is saying, is beyond my ability to carry on. He's not saying, if you notice, he's not saying, I don't believe in you. He's saying, take me home. Just take me home. I'm done. I'm finished. I'm gone. It's over. I can't do any more. I know, just on the balance of percentages, that there will be people here who can absolutely relate to that experience. I am done in. I still believe in you, but I cannot stay in this world any longer. Take me home. I get that. I don't think I've ever been quite where Elijah is, not quite. I think he's representative of how extreme our emotions can get, and that is valid before God. How do we know it's valid before God? For those fragile emotions, that brokenness, why is that valid before God? It's valid for two reasons. First reason is this: because Elijah takes it before God. That's where he goes with it. He doesn't take it into his own hands. He says, I'm done in, I'm finished, I've forget it, I can't carry on, but it's you that I'm coming to. And it's valid because of our second area, which is this: the holistic care of God. In all our emotions, do you know if you've done something so amazing for somebody else and you think you've kind of moved to a whole new level of relationship, and then something else happens and they don't trust you in the way that you think you've proven yourself trustworthy? You know, you've really kind of nailed your heart into an experience for them. And it's proven so beneficial to them. And then a month down the line, they are back where, what do you feel like doing? You feel like getting hold of them and shaking them and saying, will you listen? What did I do last time? It's not how God deals with us. That is not how God deals with Elijah. He knows the frailty. He knows the fragility of what it is to be human in this world. What did Elijah need? He needed rest. And that's what God gave him. I love this little bit. Verse 5, he lay down and under the bush and fell asleep. The next bit is, honestly, it's some of my favorite verses in the whole of the Old Testament. All at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. I think that's just amazing. What does God give him? He gives him the ordinary creational provision that he has made available for us in this world. He gives him food, drink, and sleep. He says, you need it. And I know who you are. I know you're frail. I know you need sleep. By the way, you can come to me anytime because I never sleep. But I know you need sleep. I know the realities of what it is to be human because I've created you. I know that you are limited unlike me. I know that you need nutrition. I know that your body needs to be rebuilt. I know that part of your spiritual brokenness is your physical fragility. Don't forget that. In our spiritual journey, that there are times where our physical fragility can impact how we think we are spiritually. We get so low, and actually what we need is rest, sleep, nutrition, some more rest. That's what we need. We need to be physically nurtured. Why is that important? Because God does not separate us out into spiritual and physical and ignore the physical. He made us spiritual, physical beings. We are both of those contained in one, and he cares for them both. The holistic care of God. You see, Elijah's mission, it's an embodied mission. It's not just sitting somewhere in the background pouring out spiritualities on the people. He's had to climb Mount Carmel. He's had to dig a trench. He's had to lay an altar. He's had to slaughter a bull. He's had to pray. He's had to be physically there. He's had to run away. He's had to break down the Asherah poles and the temples of Baal, which started the whole crisis in the first place. He's had to do all of those things. His spiritual experience is lived out, as our spiritual experience is lived out as well. We live our Christian faith. We live it day to day, and the world that we live in takes its toll on our faith because we are physical beings as well. And I love the fact that God feeds him. What did Jesus do when the people were away from the shops, been listening to his ministry and they were just done? He fed them, miraculously fed them. because he knows that we are physical beings. Let's have a look at why he fed him. Because it's really easy to think that he fed him because of what he had done previously, which is true. You know, he is exhausted because he's run away and he probably hasn't eaten for however long. He's just exhausted, hungry, tired, all the rest of it. It's because of what has gone before. But let's have a look at what the power of this God encounter is really all about. He goes to sleep again, and God wakes him up. I think he wakes him up. I think he wakes him up to feed him, then allows him to sleep to satisfy what has gone in the past. But then he wakes him up again and he says, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. That is amazing. Because what we see there is that Elijah might have been done with this world. Elijah might have been done with his mission. But God was not done with Elijah, and God was not done with Elijah's mission. You need feeding, Elijah. You need sleep, Elijah, because you haven't got strength for the next phase of your mission. We'll come back to the 40 days and 40 nights. But where has he got to get to? He's got to get to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, where the covenant relationship, I think this is beautiful, by the way, where the covenant relationship with God is made by God with his people. It's just breathtaking that Elijah, as the prophet of God, representing the people of God, is reconciled to God by sacrifice and is then taken on a 40 days and 40 nights journey to the place again of covenant relationship. Get to Horeb. Get to the place where you know that God and his people have been reconciled. Isn't that breathtaking? I wonder whether we can just pause for a few minutes now and just think, well, if we've seen that we've got fragile emotions, if we've seen that God cares for us holistically, if we can see that God has an incredibly powerful encounter with Elijah at this point for the journey moving forward, what does it mean for us? Fragile emotions. Maybe you're just thinking about faith. Or maybe you have walked the walk of faith for decades. You need to know this, and you need to be reminded of this. That faith in Jesus Christ does not remove your challenges or make you invincible. It does neither of those. It does not remove your challenges. If you think coming to faith in Jesus Christ is going to, in relationship with the living God, is going to solve all of your problems right now, you are going to be sorely disappointed in one sense. Because it feels at times as though the reality of this world means that he hasn't solved my problems. But what do we need to know? Because if that is the best of what faith has to offer, then it's no faith of any value. Except that what we know is the eternal God has eternal relationship with his people through sacrifice, through covenant relationship, And he says, it might feel like it's not solved in the temporary life that you live in this world as it is, but it will be solved for eternity. Even though you might feel as though the greatest powers are being brought to bear against you. You know, Ahab and Jezebel are on Elijah's tail at the moment. The two most powerful people in the kingdom who've made a personal vow to kill him. You say, couldn't get much bigger than that, really. And Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 10 that you need to remember that every knee and every knee will bow before King Jesus. That's who we worship. That's who our faith is in. It might feel temporarily as though it is not resolved, but let me assure you that the message of faith in Jesus Christ through the sacrifice of Jesus, through the covenant relationship which actually bookends this narrative, is secure in eternal terms. Holistic care. Don't separate physicality from spirituality. Romans tells us this. In the worst of cases, when we are beyond even where Elijah at this point is able to pray to God. But Romans assures us of this, that when we even get beyond that, the indwelling Holy Spirit prays on our behalf. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the securing knowledge to know that when I am completely done in, you know, this physical life experience, you know, it doesn't end well, does it? Generally speaking, it doesn't end well. You look at so many of those people who we love, where the end is not good, where the experience is not good, where it's painful, where it feels as though the anchor has been ripped from the seabed and they have no relationship with the God who they have loved for all of their lives. Romans promises us this, that the power of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us at that moment prays for us when we can't pray. That's what keeps us connected to God when everybody looking on thinks we're done and finished. Because the eternal God, by the power of the Holy Spirit, dwells within us. And don't forget this, that your spiritual life is designed to be triumphant in its fragility. Fragility in our human experience as a believer is not something to overcome. It's to recognize that that is exactly where we will be, and it is exactly there where we are strengthened, where the truth of the message of God is borne out. Paul says it in Corinthians, don't you realize we have treasure in jars of clay? He says, I am a fragile jar of clay. What he's talking about there is the lowest and cheapest. It's kind of bordering on the disposable containers of McDonald's. That's kind of the idea that he's got. The treasure of the message of the gospel is in a McDonald's tray. It's that fragile. If God is willing, not even willing, actually, that's way too weak a word. If God embraces the success of his mission in this world through jars of clay. Why do we fight so hard to not be jars of clay? As though somehow we're not meeting the expectations of what it is to be a believer, when Paul says that's how it is. That is why the gospel is so powerful, because it's not us. It's weak, fragile Elijahs who've given up and want to die, that the mission of God is accomplished in. Thirdly, the power of God in an encounter. What strength did Elijah need when God woke him for a second time? He needed enough strength to travel from where he was to Horeb. And God gave him that. That's what God delivers to us. Just enough to make the next step of the journey. That's great news. But what's even better news is that the past is the past with God. The fear of Elijah, the fact that he couldn't see the glory and majesty of God in the sacrifice, and to have the confidence to stand up to Ahab and Jezebel, is the past. It's the past, it's gone. That's what the sacrifice does. It makes the past the past. That's why the sacrifice of Jesus only needs to happen once, because we are in this amazing position where in the history and time of this world, the sacrifice of Jesus is always more in the past than our past. Everything that's back in our life that we look and we say, what about this? What about that? There's a sacrifice back there that satisfies for all of it. The cross is always beyond our past. And Elijah is strengthened to arrive at the mountain of God. How is that? How is it that Elijah is strengthened? And let's forget about Elijah for a minute. Let's ask this question. How is it that we're strengthened? We're strengthened because there was another greater Elijah who went on a 40-day, 40-night separation from everything like Elijah does here, who suffered the most intense temptation beyond any experience that we could ever experience. And he triumphed. And if Jesus was baptized, went through 40 days and 40 nights of temptation, and then reappeared for the rest of his ministry, that's exactly what happens for Elijah. Exactly that. His ministry is only kind of beginning with the sacrifice on Mount Carmel. And he goes away for 40 days and 40 nights. And then he finds this place of covenant relationship with God again at Horeb. And the rest of his ministry is in front of him. I pray that for every one of us in all of our life situations, we will know that the sacrifice in the past of Jesus Christ is sufficient for our ministry moving forward. That we can go forward because he has already laid the path. By the way, for all that Elijah might have been terrified, might have run, he absolutely needed to be where he was to go on a journey to Horeb. It always works like that. Joseph put it this way. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Hold on to that in our life experience. Those terrible things are the springboards on which God builds our faith in him.